right. Hey, everybody. We are once again live to take your questions, discussions. Today, we are talking about, and only talking about, by the way, we're not going to get sidetracked here. We're going to try and stay on topic about Paul. And so, Paul is just a lightning rod when it comes to criticism. You have skeptics who think that he's hallucinated something on the road to Damascus, but he definitely did not see the risen Jesus. Um, and then you have people like Muslims or New Age gurus like Aaron Abke who say that no, Paul was a deceiver. He was a liar. He hijacked Christianity. He completely changed the message because he, just had some sort of evil motives. He was a deceiver. And then, of course, there's the traditional view, which is Paul is really an apostle. He really was sent by the Lord Jesus Christ. He worked miracles. He founded churches. He ministered all over the place. And so, yeah, that's what we're discussing. We're going to be talking about the evidence that Paul really was an apostle. And with me is, again, my friend Jonathan McClatchy. Thanks again for joining, Jonathan.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me again.
Yeah, definitely. So this stream, who is this stream for? Just real quick, it is for if you have doubts, maybe you're a Christian and you've heard these objections, and maybe they really bother you. I think there was even a recent video by Apologia. I haven't watched it yet, where a biblical scholar said that Paul just never even really converted. Paula Fredrickson and her crazy theories about the Apostle Paul. Maybe you've listened to some James Tabor videos on Myth Vision or something like that. Or heard criticisms by Bart Ehrman, whatever. If you want to talk about that, if those objections actually bother you, Jonathan and I are willing to show you that there is just a plethora of evidence that acts as a reliable document that really shows the life and doing of Paul, the travels of Paul and his teachings and all that other kind of stuff. Or if you are a non-Christian or maybe even a former Christian, I don't care, Muslim, whoever, if you are welcome to join. And so why don't we go ahead and talk about the argument, Jonathan, if you want to just kind of outline the sketch for the whole Pauline trilemma here.
Sure. So the conversion of Paul argument is essentially a two-step argument. The first step is to establish that the accounts in the book of Acts, specifically in Acts 9, 22 and 26 concerning Paul's conversion testimony, actually represent what Paul himself said. It represents his own testimony. And moreover, the accounts of Paul's miracles in the book of Acts represent Paul's testimony also. And there's a torrent of evidence to establish that foundational premise, which we're happy to get into the details of. That being the case, we need to evaluate, okay, what best accounts for Paul's testimony? Is it that he was lying? Is it that he was sincerely mistaken? Or is the content of what he alleged true? And these are logically exhaustive scenarios. Now, when it comes to the contention that Paul was lying, that seems to be seriously out of step with the context of the claim. In particular, the fact that Paul was willing to undergo such tremendous hardships, sufferings, persecutions, and so forth on account of the gospel. And moreover, not only was he willing to undergo tremendous hardships on account of the gospel, but he anticipated other believers undergoing similar hardships and sufferings and persecutions as well. For example, in Philippians 1:29, he says, "For it's been granted to you that for the sake of Christ, you should not only believe in him, but also suffer for his sake, engaged in the same conflict that I saw I had and I hear that I still have." And there's various other texts along similar lines. For example, in 2 Thessalonians, he says, "Therefore we ourselves boast about you in the churches of God for your steadfastness and faith in all your persecutions and in the afflictions that you are enduring." Or in Romans 8:17, he says, "And if children, then heirs, heirs of God and fellow heirs with Christ, provided we suffer with him in order that we may also be glorified with him," and so forth. Given that, as Sir George Littleton notes, at that time, when St. Paul undertook the preaching of the gospel, to persuade any man to be a Christian was to persuade him to expose himself to all the cruelty human nature could suffer. This St. Paul knew. This he not only expected, but warned those he taught to look for it too. How much reason he had to say this, the hatred, the contempt, the torments, the deaths endured by the Christians in that age and long afterwards abundantly prove. Whoever professed the gospel under these circumstances, without an entire conviction of its being a divine revelation, must have been mad. And if he made others profess it by fraud or deceit, he must have been worse than mad. He must have been the most hardened wretch that ever breathed. Could any man who had in his nature the least spark of humanity subject his fellow creatures to so many miseries? Or could one that had in his mind the least ray of reason expose himself to share them with those he deceived, in order to advance a religion which he knew to be false, merely for the sake of its moral doctrines? Such an extravagance is too absurd to be supposed, and I dwell too long on a notion that upon a little reflection confutes itself. So it seems highly implausible for those reasons that Paul was a deceiver. Moreover, he exercises tremendous financial integrity. For example, in 1 Corinthians 4, he says, he's writing from Ephesus at this time, and he says, "To the present hour we hunger and thirst, we are poorly dressed and buffeted and homeless, and we labor working with our own hands." And that, of course, dovetails with the account in Acts 20, where Paul addresses the Ephesian elders, and he says, "I coveted no one's silver or gold or apparel. You yourselves know that these hands ministered to my necessities and to those who are with me." In 1 Corinthians 9, he says, "In the same way, the Lord commanded that those who proclaim the gospel should get their living by the gospel. But I made no use of any of these rights, nor am I writing these things to secure any such provision." In 2 Corinthians, he says, "Here for the third time, I'm ready to come to you, and I will not be a burden, for I seek not what is yours, but you. For children are not obligated to save up for their parents, but parents for their children. I will most gladly spend to be spent for your souls. If I love you more, am I to be loved less?" Or in 1 Thessalonians, he says, "You remember, brothers," so he's appealing to their eyewitness memory of his conduct among them, "our labor and toil. We work night and day, that we might not be a burden to any of you, while we proclaim to you the gospel of God. You are witnesses, and God also, how holy and righteous and blameless was our conduct toward you believers. For you know how, like a father with his children, we exhorted each one of you, and encourage you, and charge you to walk in a manner worthy of God, who calls you into his own kingdom and glory." Or in 2 Thessalonians, he says, "You yourselves know how you ought to imitate us, because we were not idle when we were with you. We did not, nor did we eat anyone's bread without paying for it, but with toil and labor we worked night and day, that we might not be a burden to any of you. It was not because we do not have that right, but to give you and ourselves an example to imitate," and so forth. Now, and so it doesn't appear that Paul was in it for financial gain. Moreover, he doesn't appear to have been in it for self-promotion or the power either. In Philippians 1, for example, he's writing from prison in Rome, and he writes, "Some indeed preach Christ from envy and rivalry, but others from goodwill. The latter do it out of love, knowing that I am put here for the defense of the gospel. The former proclaim Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, but thinking to afflict me in my imprisonment. What then? Only that in every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is proclaimed, and in that I rejoice." So it really doesn't. These are not the words of a narcissist, right? Someone who's in it for self-promotion, self-aggrandizement. In view of the considerations we've just surveyed, it seems highly improbable that Paul was deliberately setting out to deceive people about Christianity. And so the question then is, well, how did he come to sincerely believe that he'd had an encounter with Jesus on the Damascus Road? And when we inspect the content of the testimony, which is recounted in Acts 9, Acts 22, and Acts 26, it seems highly implausible that Paul was sincerely mistaken. The encounter purportedly is multisensory, involving both a visual and auditory component. Moreover, so Paul hears a light, he sees a light, he hears a voice with whom he has a dialogue and receives instructional content. It's also intersubjective in the sense that it affects not only Paul, but also his traveling companions who are thrown to the ground along with Paul. They see they hear the voice, although not seeing anyone. Apparently they do perceive the light. Paul's blinded by the experience for 3 days. He's subsequently healed on command by Ananias, and Ananias and Paul both receive mutual visions concerning each other. And then Paul subsequently is able to perform miracles, which he describes in his own words. He's addressing the Corinthians, which, bear in mind, involves a contingent of skeptics. If you can pull up my screen here again. 2 Corinthians 12:12, he says, "The signs of a true apostle were performed among you, with utmost patience, with signs and wonders and mighty works." And of course, as I said, the Corinthians involved a contingent of skeptics who were critical of Paul's apostolic credentials. This is a pretty risky thing to be saying if there were no such miraculous signs to speak of. And he's been to the Corinthian church, and he says that miraculous signs were performed in their midst. He hadn't been to the Roman church, but he does mention it in Romans 15 also that he seems to have acquired a reputation for performing signs and miracles. He says, "For I will not venture to speak of anything except what Christ has accomplished through me to bring the Gentiles to obedience by word and deed, by the power of signs and wonders, by the power of the Spirit of God." And Paul doesn't tell us any details about those alleged miracles. But if we look at the accounts in Acts, and I would contend, and I'm happy to make this case, that the accounts in Acts concerning Paul's miracles also represent Paul's testimony. Paul performs various miracles. For example, in Cyprus, he causes this guy Bar Jesus, also known as Elymas, the magician, to go blind on command. And after Elymas has stood against Paul and Barnabas, seeking to turn the proconsul away from the faith. In fact, this is so convincing, it results in the conversion of the proconsul, Sergius Paulus, on Cyprus. In chapter 14, he heals a guy in Lystra who had been crippled since birth and unable to use his feet, which greatly impresses the crowds. In chapter 16, he is in Philippi and he's cast out a spirit of divination from a slave girl, which disrupts the business of her owners because she's no longer capable of fortune telling, which ultimately gets him and Silas thrown in prison in Philippi. And then he and Silas have a miraculous jailbreak, right? And that, again, is these things, especially taken in aggregate, are extremely difficult to be honestly wrong about. And so if it's not plausible Paul was lying, nor that he was sincerely mistaken, the best explanation is that the content of what he alleged is true. And so the most crucial aspect of that argument then is establishing the foundational premise that the accounts of Paul's conversion and miracles in the book of Acts actually represent what Paul himself went around saying or had given to Luke. So let me just give you a sample of some of the evidence that relates to that. So there's both an indirect evidence as well as more direct evidence. The indirect evidence is that evidence which bears broadly on the historicity of Acts, showing that the author is someone who is in proximity to Paul, so Paul's traveling associate, someone who's very close up to the facts, and someone who is very well informed about Paul's itinerant travels, and someone who is habitually scrupulous in reportage of information. And that in itself provides a justification for thinking that he is reliably representing Paul's own testimony concerning his conversion and miracles that he performed or experienced. And then there's also more direct evidence that bears specifically on those passages. But let's consider the indirect case first. So one class of evidence that we would put forward is what we call undesigned coincidences between Acts and Paul's letters. And for example, in chapter 15 of Acts, we read about Paul and Barnabas separating over John Mark, who's previously withdrawn from them on a mission through Pamphylia and not gone with them to the work. In fact, this causes such a sharp disagreement that Paul and Barnabas actually part ways. Now, this suggests that there's some sort of prior connection, prior relationship involving John Mark and Barnabas, of which Acts does not take note. If we go over to Colossians, this is one of Paul's prison letters that he wrote from Rome around 60 to 62 AD. Paul writes, Aristarchus, my fellow prisoner, greets you, and Mark, the cousin of Barnabas. They're actually cousins. They have a familial relationship, a detail not supplied by Acts. But it appears that by the time Paul wrote Colossians, this rift between Paul and Barnabas over John Mark's been resolved. There is no mention of it here. In fact, it looks like they're all on good terms again by now, right? But it doesn't appear that the author of Acts is inventing this story to go with Colossians. There's no mention in Acts of the familial relationship. So they can't fit together or dovetail in a way that supports their mutual historicity.
Yeah.
Or
we do have a calling guest. Is it okay if we bring him up, or
sure.
I don't want to cut you off mid argument there, but we'll bring him up and maybe we could get into this a little bit more. TJ, you are on stage, my friend.
Yo, can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, how's your day?
Just going good. So are you?
Yeah.
Who's Paul? Is he deceived? Is he a liar or?
Yeah.
Or
yeah, I think Paul contradicts the Gospels for Mark, Matthew, Luke, because I can grant you that Paul has high Christology. Okay. I don't think Mark has no Christology. Would you say that Paul can still be a true apostle if he contradicts the Gospel of Mark?
The Gospel of Mark on Christology?
Yeah. Like, sorry to interrupt you. Sorry. Like, do you believe that the Bible is a univocal text, meaning in Christology?
I do, yeah.
Okay. So can you demonstrate where Mark portrays Jesus as Yahweh, not in a verbatimly, that's a verbatim word fallacy. Yeah. But yeah. What's the concept?
Let me pull up my screen here again. Okay, let's go over to Mark 2.
The Lord of the Sabbath?
Well, that would be one text, but let me make the argument first. So there's actually multiple arguments one can make for Mark 2, and I was actually going to go to the bridegroom language first. So so in Mark 2, we read, now John's disciples and the Pharisees were fasting, and people came and said to him, why do John's disciples and the disciples of the Pharisees fast, but your disciples do not fast? And Jesus said to them, Can the wedding guests fast while the bridegroom is with them? As long as they have the bridegroom with them, they cannot fast. The days will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them, and then they will fast in that day. Now, this bridegroom language is drawn from the Old Testament. There are various texts throughout the Old Testament where God uses this metaphor to describe his own relationship to his people. So, for instance, in Isaiah 54, for your maker is your husband, and the Lord of hosts is his name, and the Holy One of Israel is your Redeemer. He goes on, for the Lord has called you like a wife deserted and grieved in spirit, like a wife of youth when she is cast off, says your God. Or in Isaiah 62, you shall no more be termed forsaken, and your land shall no more be termed desolate, but you shall be called, my delight is in her, and your land married, for the Lord delights in you, and your land shall be married. For as the young man marries the young woman, so shall your sons marry you, and as the bridegroom rejoices over the bride, so shall your sons rejoice over you. Or in Hosea chapter 2, and in that day declares the Lord, you will call me my husband, and no longer will you call me my Baal, and so forth. Or in verse 19, I will betroth you to me forever. I will betroth you to me in righteousness and justice, in steadfast love and in mercy. Or in Jeremiah 2, verse 2, go and proclaim in the hearing of Jerusalem, thus says the Lord, I remember the devotion of your youth, your love as a bride, how you followed me in the wilderness and a land not sown, and so forth. Or in Ezekiel chapter 16, when I passed by you again and saw you, behold, you were at the age for love, and I spread the corner of my garment over you and covered your nakedness. I made my vow to you and entered into a covenant with you, declares the Lord God, and you became mine. Then I bathed you with water and washed off your blood from you, and so forth. And in verse 13, it says, thus you are adorned with gold and silver, and your clothing was of fine linen and silk, and embroidered cloth. You ate fine flour and honey and oil. You grew exceedingly beautiful and advanced to royalty, and your renown went forth among the nations because of your beauty, for it was perfect, though the splendor that I had bestowed on you, declares the Lord God. So you can see that throughout various texts of the Old Testament, God uses this metaphor of a bridegroom to describe his relationship to his people. And then moreover, as you rightly noted, in the next pericope, Jesus declares himself to be Lord of the Sabbath. So here's the context. So one Sabbath, he was going through the grain fields, and as they made their way, his disciples began to pluck heads of grain, and the Pharisees were saying to him, look, why are you not doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath? And he said to them, have you never read what David did when he was in need and was hungry, he and those who were with him? Have you entered the house of God and have beathed the high priest and ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for any but the priest to eat, and also gave it to those who were with him? And he said to them, the Sabbath was made for men, not men for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord, even of the Sabbath. And so there's two possible interpretations here, right? One is to say that Jesus is identifying himself as uniquely Lord of the Sabbath, which I think would be claim to divine identity. An alternative interpretation that sometimes is offered is that he's actually referring to generic humanity as being kurios of the Sabbath. And the argument for that is that in the previous sentence, he says the Sabbath was made for men, not men for the Sabbath. And so on that interpretation, he would say, so mankind is kurios, even of the Sabbath. Now, I favor the first interpretation rather than the second one for the following reason. That earlier in the chapter, Jesus actually identified himself as the Danielic Son of Man, right? So this is the story about the paralytic. He says, why do, and people are saying he can forgive sins by God alone. And he says, why do you question these things in your hearts? Which is easier to say to the paralytic, your sins are forgiven, or to say, rise, take care of your bed and walk. But that you may know the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins. He said to the paralytic, I say to you, rise, pick up your bed and go home. And he rose and immediately picked up his bed and went. So Jesus clearly identifies himself here as the Son of Man from the book of Daniel. And so it seems the most probable or natural interpretation in verse 28 is he's identifying himself, because he just got done talking about himself as the Son of Man. He's identifying himself as uniquely Lord even of the Sabbath, which I think would be a claim to divine identity. Does that make sense?
Yeah, let me answer, because he did a lot of things, so let me answer all of that. First, is your first point, I don't want to show my position, because you want a lot of things, that the Father is given the same title as Lord of the Sabbath, and Jesus basically is Yahweh? Is that your point, basically, to shorten it down?
I'm sorry, say that again.
Are you saying that Jesus is Yahweh here because he's called the Lord of the Sabbath, and Yahweh's called the Lord of the Sabbath in Numbers, I'm pretty sure, or no, in Exodus?
I'm not aware of a specific passage that says that Yahweh is Lord of the Sabbath.
Yeah, so I would just say this. I would say when he's called the Lord of the Sabbath, it just shown that Jesus has authority over the Lord of the Sabbath. It isn't about divinity because Matthew talks about this, the same scenario in Matthew 9:8, that he was given authority to do so. And I can just go with agency. This is throughout the Bible. Like we go to Isaiah 10 verses 26. It says the Lord Almighty will lash him with the whip. I'm paraphrasing, by the way, as he will raise his staff over the waters as he did in Egypt. Was it Yahweh who did it in Egypt, or was it Aaron and Moses who did it in Egypt?
Sorry, you're a little quiet, so I'm having a little.
Yeah, sorry. I'm saying this. They can just be agencies since Jesus represents Yahweh. We see this throughout the Bible. Okay, like for example, Isaiah 10 verses 26, right? It says the Lord Almighty will lash him with the whip as he will raise his staff over the waters as he did in Egypt. Who did it in Egypt? Who raised the staff over in Egypt? In Exodus.
I don't think that the language of agency applies here. Jesus calls himself Lord of the Sabbath. Do you think Moses or Elijah could say that he's Lord of the Sabbath? Do you think John the Baptist could say that he's Lord of the Sabbath? And God reveals himself in the Old Testament as uniquely the bridegroom to his people. It seems quite strange to say, well, Jesus could also say that because he's God's agent. That doesn't make a lot of sense.
No, it does, because I'm showing you where Moses and Aaron's called Yahweh as the agent. Okay.
Yeah, Moses is called Elohim in Exodus 7:1. I'm aware of the language of agency.
No, not 7:1. No, not Exodus 7:1. No, not that. Not that. Exodus 7 verses 17 through 19. I'm pairing it with Isaiah 10 verse 26. Isaiah 10 verse 26 says that Yahweh was the one who raised the staff over the waters as he did in Egypt. Who did it? Was it Aaron or was it Yahweh who did it in Exodus 7?
Aaron.
Is Aaron Yahweh or is he an agent of Yahweh?
He's an agent of Yahweh.
What's the symmetry breaker between that and Mark 2?
I'm aware of your language of agency. I just don't think it applies to this particular
example.
Well, for the reasons I've already given you.
Well, I rebuttal it. I just rebutted it with this.
Well, yeah, and your rebuttal, frankly, TJ, your rebuttal just isn't very convincing. So
what's the argument for that?
Your rebuttal.
What's the argument?
What's the argument for that?
Yeah.
The argument that he already gave you. Who else is going to say that they're the Lord of the Sabbath?
That's the argument from silence. That's the argument from silence. That's why you know that.
He's bridegroom to his people.
Yeah, I just said that can just be agency.
Right. So
hold on.
So agency in this case, forgive sins, is the Lord of the Sabbath and is also the bridegroom.
Yeah, because he's given the authority to do so. How we see in John 5:19, Matthew 9.
So who is the bridegroom? Who is the bridegroom? Who is the bridegroom?
I didn't stop interrupting me. Why are you
panicking, dude?
I'm not panicking, bro. I'm right here.
You are, man.
I'm right here. What are we doing here, bro?
Why are you freaking out about this?
The bridegroom is your point is I know your point. Let me explain. You just went to the sense. You blundered really bad. Wait, hold on. He's given the authority to do so. He does not have it essentially. You have to provide evidence when he has it essentially. For the disciples, they were given it by Jesus in John chapter 20, verse 23. Jesus is given authority, how we see in Matthew 9:8, Matthew 28, verse 19, John 5:19, etc., John 5:30, etc. Just because he's the Lord of Sabbath just means that he's exercising his role, authority.
How is that different than Paul? How is this different than Paul's theology of the deity?
I just answered because your justification that Paul taught that Jesus was the Most High. I'm saying that the Bible is not a univocal text with the Christology, and I'm showing for Mark. Now we're in a circle because of you.
Okay.
Because of me. So TJ, you're just trying to ore farm. You're just clip farm.
Who's
You're
trying
not
to ore
really
farm? Who's trying to ore farm?
You are, dude.
I'm not. Hey, bro.
This is games. This stream isn't for games. This stream is for people.
You're the same one who said Tertullian Trinitarian.
TJ, I'm about to mute you. I need you to
wait. Can I speak real quick though?
No, this is my turn to speak.
Okay.
Do you understand?
I mean, yeah, you already lost.
I already lost. Okay, so this is about debate clipping, or farming, and all that other stuff.
You're like, where's my time?
Shush.
You said Tertullian Trinitarian. That's a blunder.
Shush. Shush. If you unmute your mic,
stop muting me, bro. Why are you panicking?
Because I'm going to kick you.
Dude, because stop muting me.
You're insincere.
Get to the argument.
You're insincere.
Get to the argument. I'm sincere. We can talk. You just started interrupting me. I was fine to the guest. I let the guest talk for 3 minutes straight, giving 3 arguments, and I was muted the whole entire time. You're the one.
Okay, and then when we push back, you just turn this into like, I don't know, whatever you're doing right now. You're spazzing out
because you're interrupting me.
TJ, we can have a conversation, but you have to stop spazzing out. I'm just gonna move on.
You can move on. You can move on if you want. I'm just saying, like, I gave the
Okay.
guest 3 minutes.
TJ,
Hold on.
TJ.
See, you're interrupting me. What are you doing? I gave the guest, you're a nice guest, 3 minutes to talk. 3 points he made: the bridegroom, Lord of Sabbath, and forgiven sins. I'm pretty sure.
I didn't make the forgiven sins argument.
And we said that it's not, that's not coming from agency, because we don't
Okay,
see
why?
that anywhere else
Why?
in the Old
Because
Testament.
I gave you the example for Isaiah 10. Why?
Because we don't see that anywhere else in the Old Testament.
Well, I just gave you evidence that Yahweh. I can give you more. Isaiah 7 verse 3. Isaiah's called
TJ,
Yahweh because he's the agent of Yahweh.
Shush.
Yo, I ain't gonna lie, bro. Y'all got baked. Baked.
You got baked. I'm a clip farmer. Baked. I don't care. This is bad, boy.
Yeah, I think we should perhaps move on to something else.
Adios, my friend. Adios. Okay. So you got these TikTokers. That's all they want to do. So let's talk about this. I would have liked to talk to this about TJ if he was like a reasonable person. So if you're going to say that Mark has a different Christology than Paul, then first of all, Jonathan already alluded to that Paul was familiar with Mark. Most likely, this is the same Mark who wrote the same gospel, and yet they're rolling together, right? Okay, this is who this is traditionally attributed to. So it'd be real weird if Luke, who also traveled with Paul, wrote the gospel according to Luke, had a different Christology than the apostle Paul, who he's rolling with. What do we see the apostle Peter preach on the day of Pentecost? Baked. He said, whoever shall call upon the name of the Lord shall be saved. Who is the Lord in Joel 2:32? Baked. It's Yahweh. What is Jesus? That Paul preaches the same message. Jonathan and I's argument, and I don't mean to be animated. I don't have patience for these Dawa bro wannabe clip farm, whatever weirdo people from TikTok that try to come over here. This isn't what this kind of live stream is about. This is for sincere people who want answers to their questions, who aren't just looking to bake. Okay. The claim is that the hard details that Luke casually gets right over and over and over again, just going back to the last 2 videos on my channel, is that there is authorship with proximity. Luke is a traveling companion of Paul. He's a weird narrator. He's a wee narrator. He shows historical scrupulousness. He gets local stuff right casually. He has access to key witnesses. He travels with Paul. He has access to the key witnesses in Acts chapter 21, where he's in Jerusalem, where James and all the elders are present. It'd be pretty weird if James had a different Christology than Paul, and yet they're accepting of Paul, and he's meeting with them, okay? And this gives Luke access to witnesses to get this, right? We know that Luke is sincere. He's traveling with Paul at great social cost. Paul is being arrested. There's dangers. There's shipwrecks. There's all this other stuff. And so we're saying that Acts is reliable history. Luke is close to Paul. Again, it would be weird if he had a different Christology. Furthermore, what you have to do in order to say that Paul hijacked it is you're going to have to say that Acts is unreliable when we have a torrent of evidence that it's not. Acts portrays Paul as in contact with the Jerusalem leadership and receiving recognition. Acts presents Paul preaching the resurrection and the messiahship and the sonship and the deity of Christ in continuity with the apostolic proclamation patterns. It does preserve conflicts, but it's not Paul invented and hijacked a different religion. It's more like, how do the Gentiles relate to the people of God? Okay, so under this hypothesis that Paul still hijacked it, and if you grant that Acts is reliable, you're going to have to say that Paul deviated. The original disciples either didn't notice, didn't care, or were powerless, and yet Paul still somehow remained accepted, connected enough for the movement to cohere, and that the letters of Paul and the book of Acts, all the undesigned coincidences that I went through yesterday on the channel, those just still happen naturally. That's a ton of auxiliary assumptions. That's every extra ad hoc bolt that you try to attach to that lowers the prior probability. You don't know what you're talking about, dude. You don't know what you're talking about. Baked. We don't have time for this silliness. So anyways, I didn't mean to go off on a rant there, but it's like, dude, like, just shut up and listen for 5 seconds. Like, if you could let me talk, I could explain this, but no, that's not what you're about. You're trying to hijack the entire thing into a Christology thing, which we already talked about in recently, and just punt to like agency when we answered, and you're like, well, that's not an answer. Like, okay, what do you want us to do, bro? Like, so, anyways, if that does that make sense? People in the chat, are you following what I'm saying there? And so you have two gospel writers that are associated with Paul. How are you going to say they have a different Christology? And then you look at the Christology in the book of Acts, what the apostles themselves are preaching. So are you with us, TJ, that Acts is unreliable? That's where I really wanted to go with it. But you wouldn't listen for like 5 seconds. So you just, whatever. So anyways, crazy stuff. All right. Well, Jonathan, that was you could go on with the evidence. Maybe we should continue to talk about Acts because he was the only one waiting in the queue. So I'm sure he got his clip, and I'm sure he's really happy. But anyways,
okay, let me share my screen here again.
Yeah.
Second here. Here we go. Okay. So here's another example of an undesigned coincidence. So if we were to 2 Timothy chapter 3, we read, "You, however, have followed my teaching, my conduct, my aim in life, my faith, my patience, my love, my steadfastness, my persecutions and sufferings that happened to me at Antioch, at Iconium, and at Lystra, which persecutions I endured, yet from them all the Lord rescued me." Now, so Paul seems to imply that Timothy had actually witnessed the sufferings that occurred in Pisidian Antioch, at Iconium, and at Lystra, and these persecutions that he's alluding to are related in Acts chapter 13 and 14. Now, and as I said, Paul seems to imply that Timothy actually witnessed these sufferings. Now, the purpose of the second missionary journey that Paul embarks on is given in verse 36 of Acts 15. "Let's return and visit the brothers in every city where we proclaim the word of the Lord and see how they are." And in chapter 16, we read that Paul came also to Derbe and to Lystra. A disciple was there named Timothy, the son of a Jewish woman who was a believer, but his father was a Greek. He was well spoken of by the brothers at Lystra and Iconium. And so this implies that Derbe or Lystra was most likely Timothy's hometown. And Timothy is clearly already a believer by this time. And Paul himself refers to Timothy as my true child in the faith and my beloved child in 1st and 2nd Timothy, which implies that Timothy was most likely Paul's own convert, which would in turn imply that Timothy was most likely converted during the previous missionary journey at just the time when Paul underwent the sufferings alluded to in his letter to Timothy. But if Acts is using 2 Timothy as a source or vice versa, that's a very roundabout way of fitting these two texts together, right? And so that supports not only the Pauline authorship of 2 Timothy, but also the historical reliability of Acts on this particular detail. We continue into chapter 16 of Acts, and we learn about Paul and Silas getting imprisoned in Philippi. And I mentioned earlier that there was this miraculous jailbreak, and the jailer rushes in about to kill himself because there's a very steep penalty for allowing a prisoner to escape under your watch. In fact, whatever penalty was prescribed for the prisoner, well, that's now your penalty. So he's about to commit suicide. Paul announces that all are present, and then he becomes a believer, and his family get baptized. And Luke tells us that when it was day, the magistrates sent the police saying, "Let those men go." And the jailer reported these words to Paul, saying, "The magistrates are sent to let you go. Therefore, come now and go in peace." But Paul said to them, "They have beaten us publicly, uncondemned, men who are Roman citizens, and have thrown us into prison. And do they now throw us out secretly? No, let them come themselves and take us out." The police reported these words to the magistrates, and they were afraid when they heard that they were Roman citizens, so they came and apologized to them, and they took them out and asked them to leave the city. So Paul's pretty upset about the fact that he's been beaten publicly, despite being a Roman citizen. And it was against Roman law to flog or to publicly beat or to crucify a Roman citizen. In fact, if you read Cicero says, "It is a crime to bind a Roman citizen, to scourge him as a wickedness, to put him to death is almost parricide. What shall I say of crucifying him? So guilty an action cannot by any possibility be adequately expressed by any name bad enough for it." So being a Roman citizen came with certain privileges. And Paul is pretty indignant about the way he's been treated. But he writes about this in his own words in 1 Thessalonians 2. He says, "Though we had already suffered and been shamefully treated at Philippi. As you know, we had boldness under God to declare to the gospel of God in the midst of much conflict. So this raises an interesting question. How did the Thessalonians know about Paul's shameful treatment in Philippi? Paul doesn't say. Going back over to Acts, though, where's Paul's very next port of call? When they had passed through Amphipolis and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica, where there was a synagogue of the Jews. So his very next port of call is, in fact, Thessalonica. In fact, let me pull up a map here. So this shows the journey from Philippi over here to Thessalonica over here. These are both within the province of Macedonia. In fact, this is on a major Roman highway, the Via Ignatia. Both of them only were overnight stops on that highway, so it's a piece of specialized local information as well. But you can imagine Paul coming from Philippi to Thessalonica, still full of indignation about the way he's been treated in Philippi, recounting to the new converts there what just happened in Philippi. But it doesn't, I mean, First Thessalonians arguably is Paul's earliest letter, but it doesn't appear that the author of Acts is using it as a source for the composition of his own narrative. For example, in chapter 1, Paul emphasizes how you turn to God from idols to serve the living and true God. So he emphasizes the conversion of pagans in Thessalonica, whereas Acts emphasizes the conversion of Jews and God-fearing Gentiles. These are not mutually exclusive, but it does point to the independence of Acts and First Thessalonians. And so that bolsters the evidential force of the undesigned coincidences between Acts and First Thessalonians, including this one. In chapter 17, Paul and Silas are in Thessalonica, and there's this mob of Jews that stir up trouble for them there. And so they have to leave in haste to go to Berea, which is about 4 to 5 miles away from Thessalonica, also within the province of Macedonia. And unfortunately for Paul and Silas, this mob of Jews follow them, and we pick up the story here in verse 13. But when the Jews from Thessalonica learned the word of God was proclaimed by Paul at Berea also, they came there too, agitating and stirring up the crowds. Then the brothers immediately sent Paul off on his way to the sea, but Silas and Timothy remained there. Those who conducted Paul brought him as far as Athens, and after receiving a command for Silas and Timothy to come to him as soon as possible, they departed. So Paul has to leave Berea in haste because of this mob of Jews, and so he leaves for Athens, but he leaves behind Silas and Timothy with instructions to catch up with them as soon as possible. And so we presume that they catch up with them not long thereafter in Athens. In fact, it tells us in verse 16 that Paul was waiting for them at Athens. But the next we see of them is not when Paul's in Athens. It's when Paul's in Corinth in chapter 18, when finally Silas and Timothy arrived from Macedonia. And we wonder, what's the holdup here? Why are they only catching up with Paul now? Just to illustrate this on the map. So this is Berea up here in Macedonia. So Paul leaves Berea and he sails down here to the peninsula of Greece, to Athens, leaving Silas and Timothy behind. And then they are told to catch up with him as soon as possible. Paul's waiting for them in Athens, but they only catch up with them when Paul's in Corinth over here in Achaia. So what's with that holdup? Why the delay? What's going on there? Well, we're not told in Acts. There's an unexplained gap in the account in the book of Acts. But if we go over to 1 Thessalonians 3, Paul writes, "Therefore, when you could bear it no longer, we were willing to be left behind at Athens alone, and we sent Timothy, our brother, and God's co-worker in the gospel of Christ, to establish and exhort you in your faith, that no one be moved with these afflictions. For you yourselves know that we are destined for this. For when we were with you, we kept telling you beforehand that we were to suffer affliction, just as it has come to pass, and just as you know. For this reason, when you could bear it no longer, I sent to learn about your faith, for fear that some of the tempter or tempted you, and our labor would be in vain." And so apparently, under the circumstances, Paul was concerned for the well-being of the Christians back in Macedonia, back in Thessalonica specifically. So he commissioned Timothy to go back from Athens to Macedonia to check up on the Christians in Thessalonica. This detail is not supplied by Acts. Acts doesn't mention Timothy being sent back from Athens to Macedonia. But that detail in 1 Thessalonians helps to explain this otherwise unaccounted for gap in the account in Acts. And so it supports the historicity of the account in Acts. Furthermore, in chapter 18, Paul's in Corinth. It tells us that Paul left Athens and went to Corinth, and he found a Jew named Aquila, native of Pontus, recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to leave Rome. We actually have independent attestation for this from Suetonius in his Life of Claudius, who mentions, and scholars generally date this to 49 AD, which is actually dated on the basis of the account in Acts, but this is typically dated to 49 AD. from Suetonius. He banished from Rome, Claudius banished from Rome all the Jews who were continually making disturbances at the instigation of one Chrestus. And in the case of Aquila and Priscilla, they end up in Corinth. And he went to see them because he was of the same trade, and he stayed with them and worked, for they were tent makers by trade. And he reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath and tried to persuade Jews and Greeks. So his ministry model is that during the week he's working with his hands as a tent maker, and then on the Sabbath day he goes into the synagogue and reasons with the Jews and Greeks. And then something happens in verse 5 that prompts him to change his ministry model. It says, when Silas and Timothy arrived from Macedonia, Paul was occupied with the word, testifying to the Jews that the Christ was Jesus. Now, unfortunately, the ESV that I have open here doesn't do the best job of capturing the nuance of the Greek. Most translations do. For example, the NIV translates this as when Silas and Timothy came from Macedonia, Paul devoted himself exclusively to preaching, testifying to the Jews that Jesus was the Messiah. In fact, if you look up a Greek English lexicon on this verb syneko that's used here in Acts 18:5, one of its meanings, this is a Greek English lexicon, one of its meanings is to occupy someone's attention intensively. Synekome tini, I am occupied with or absorbed in something. And actually gives the example of Acts 18:5 to illustrate synekoto to logo. Paul was wholly absorbed in preaching, in contrast to the activity cited in verse 3. So as the New English translation, translational notes remark, the imperfect synekoto has been translated as an ingressive imperfect, became wholly absorbed, stressing the change in Paul's activity once Silas and Timothy arrived. At this point, Paul apparently began to work less and preach more. So what prompts this change? Apparently he changes from working with his hands as a tent maker during the week and doing his ministry activities on the Sabbath to devoting himself more fully to his ministry. It apparently has something to do with the arrival of Silas and Timothy from Macedonia. We don't know from Acts, though, what that is. But if we go over to 2 Corinthians 11, Paul says, did I commit a sin in humbling myself so you might be exalted because I preached God's gospel to you free of charge? I robbed other churches by accepting support from them in order to serve you. And when I was with you and was in need, I did not burden anyone, for the brothers who came from Macedonia supplied my need. So I refrained and will refrain from burdening you in any way. And so apparently the brothers who came from Macedonia brought with them financial aid for Paul, which enabled him to change his ministry model. In fact, in Philippians 1, there's further support for this. Philippi was also a city in Macedonia. Some indeed preach Christ from envy and rivalry, but others from goodwill. The latter do it out of love, knowing that I am put here for the defense of the gospel. The former proclaim Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, but thinking to afflict me in my imprisonment. What then? Only that in every way, whether in pretense or in truth. Philippians 4. So he said, so in Philippians 4, he says, it was kind of you to share my trouble. And you Philippians yourselves know it. In the beginning of the gospel, when I left Macedonia, no church entered into partnership with me in giving and receiving except you only. Even at Thessaloniki, sought my help for my needs once again. So apparently the Philippians were involved in providing financially for Paul's need when he left Macedonia. And so that dovetails then with the account in Acts chapter 18, which says that he changed his ministry model in response to the arrival of Silas and Timothy from Macedonia. Now, to take another example, in 1 Corinthians 4, Paul says, that's why, so he's writing 1 Corinthians from Ephesus in Asia Minor, and he says, that's why I sent you Timothy, my beloved and faithful child of the Lord, to remind you of my ways in Christ, as I teach them everywhere in every church. So at the time of his writing from Ephesus to Corinth, apparently he's already sent Timothy on his way, hence the aorist tense here. That's why I sent you Timothy. But in chapter 16, verse 10, he says, when Timothy comes, in Greek, he introduces a subjunctive mood. Literally, if Timothy comes, see the epitome is among you, for he's doing the work of the Lord as I am. So even though he's already sent Timothy on his way, he apparently nonetheless expects us there to get there first. And so we'd infer that Timothy must have taken a route from Ephesus to Corinth that's less direct than that taken by the letter. In fact, if we look at a map here, here we go. This is Ephesus down here in Asia Minor. This is Corinth, the city to which Paul's writing. The most direct way to send the letters by boat over the Aegean Sea, and would infer that Timothy must have taken the indirect overland route going up through Troas and Macedonia en route to Corinth. Meanwhile, Paul remains behind in Ephesus to write 1 Corinthians. Now, when we go over to Acts 19, this is precisely what we find. After these events, Paul resolved in the Spirit to pass through Macedonia and go to Jerusalem, saying, after I have been there, I must also see Rome. And having sent to Macedonia 2 of his helpers, Timothy and Erastus, he himself stayed in Asia for a while. So he does, in fact, remain behind in Ephesus, having sent Timothy up through Macedonia, precisely as you'd predict, given those clues in 1 Corinthians. But notice just how incidental that connection is. It doesn't even mention Corinth as Timothy's destination. It's only actually in chapter 20, verse 4, that we read that Timothy is one of those who travels with Paul out of Corinth, which implies that he did in fact make it to Corinth. In fact, also, who's Timothy's traveling companion? Is this kind of called Erastus? Well, who's Erastus? Well, the book of Romans is actually, we can establish on independent grounds. It was written around Acts 20, verse 3, when Paul's in Corinth. Now, in Romans 16, 23, Paul says Erastus is actually the city treasurer of the place from which Paul's writing Romans, which we know independently is Corinth. And so how fitting then that Timothy on his way up through Macedonia is traveling with someone whom we independently know was actually from Corinth. So that's another undesigned coincidence. Moreover, in 2 Corinthians 1, Paul expresses how he had previously intended to come to Corinth sooner, but his travel plans got delayed because there was a situation in Corinth with a man who was guilty of immorality. He'd taken his father's wife. And Paul writes 1 Corinthians, and he thinks to himself, you know what? I want to give the Corinthians more time to get the situation resolved. I don't want to have to make another painful visit to them, so I'm going to delay my travels to Corinth and go up through Macedonia first, rather than go straight from Ephesus to Corinth and up through Macedonia and then come back to Corinth for them and have Corinth send them on his way to Judea. He delays his travel plans in response to the situation in Corinth. This is what he writes in 2 Corinthians. He says, because I was sure of this, I wanted to come to you first so you might have a second experience of grace. I wanted to visit you on my way to Macedonia and to come back to you from Macedonia and have you send me on my way to Judea. Was I vacillating when I wanted to do this? And so on. And then he goes on, but I called God to witness against me. It was to spare you that I refrained from coming again to Corinth. Not that we lorded over your faith, but we work with you for your joy, for you stand firm in your faith. For I made up my mind not to make another painful visit to you. For if I cause you pain, who is there to make me glad but the one whom I have pained? And I wrote as I did, so that when I came, I might not suffer pain from those who should have made me rejoice. But I felt sure of all of you that my joy would be the joy of you all. For I wrote to you, so he's writing about having previously written 1 Corinthians, for I wrote to you out of much affliction and anguish of heart and with many tears, not to cause you pain, but to let you know the abundant love that I have for you. Now, if we go over to 1 Corinthians 16:5, we have a similar indication. I will visit you after passing through Macedonia, for I intend to pass through Macedonia. So apparently it was when writing 1 Corinthians that he made his decision to delay his travels to Corinth and go up through Macedonia first. Now, with that in mind, let's go over to Acts 19 again. So we just placed the writing of 1 Corinthians here in Acts 19:22. Now let's look at verse 21. After these events, Paul resolved in the Spirit to pass through Macedonia and Achaia and go to Jerusalem. This is so it's precisely here that Luke mentions that Paul resolved to pass through Macedonia and Achaia and go to Jerusalem. So that sketches out Paul's intended itinerary for himself. Now, that comes to fruition in chapter 20 and then 21. But why mention it here? Because this is precisely when Paul purposed to delay his travels to Achaia and go up through Macedonia first. So again, but Luke doesn't mention Paul writing a letter, doesn't mention the situation in Corinth. So it's very incidental and undesigned in a way that supports historicity. Here's another example. In 1 Corinthians 1, Paul says, I thank God that I baptized none of you except Crispus and Gaius, so that no one may say that you were baptized in my name. I did baptize also the household of Stephanas. Beyond that, I do not know whether I baptized anyone else. Now, as William Paley notes in his Hora Paulinae, it may be expected that those whom the apostle baptized with his own hands were converts, distinguished from the rest by some circumstance, either of eminence or of connection with him. And as for, so these particular households are baptized by Paul's own hand. Now, what is it about those individuals that prompts them? It must be some connection with Paul, or some special connection with Paul, or some a position of eminence on their part. So in the case of Gaius, we know from the book of Romans that Gaius was actually Paul's host in Corinth and actually hosted the church there. He hosted the church in his house. Stephanas, Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians, was actually his household were the first converts in Achaia. But what about Crispus? Well, let's go over to Acts 18, verse 8. Now, Luke does not mention Crispus's household being baptized by Paul's own hand. That's found only in 1 Corinthians. But Acts tells us a detail about Crispus that's not found in 1 Corinthians or in any of Paul's letters. He tells us Crispus, the ruler of the synagogue, believed in the Lord together with his entire household. And so that makes a great deal of sense then of why he's one of the households whom Paul baptizes with his own hand. And so it fits together again with the account in Paul's letters fit together with the account in Acts in an incidental way that supports the historicity of the account in Acts. So that's just a sample. There's obviously a lot more examples of undesigned coincidences between Acts and Paul's letters. Indeed, if you only give me Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, and Galatians, the first 4 letters in the New Testament, I can already adduce no less than 40 unique examples of these undesigned coincidences. In fact, I have a whole essay on my website titled "The Book of Acts' High Resolution Reportage."
Yeah.
Which covers no less than 40 unique examples. Eric, is there anyone in the backstage right now, or if not, I can cover some more content.
I can bring them up. No, that's good. I was just going to say I'm going to share the link to that article. It's really, really good in the live chat. And so yeah, there are just tons of them in there. And so definitely check out the article. I'll bring up Jonathan. So we got a couple of Jonathans here. All right, Jonathan, you up? Are you there?
Hi, Eric. Hi, Jonathan. Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yes,
we
sir.
can hear you just fine.
Great. Well, Jonathan, when I came, Jonathan was talking about undesigned coincidence of the Gospels, and yeah,
Book
we
of
can
Acts and
still,
Paul's letters.
okay, but we can still talking about the New Testament,
Yeah.
because I would ask you guys if which you would say would be it's a definitive point to look to to the Gospels and the text of the New Testament, and to say that no, these are historical content, and that's really there is a good reason to evaluate them different from Greek, other religious Greek texts like Odyssey and so on. So what about you would say, look at these, and that is why we must to look to the New Testament different.
Well, what we're talking about is number one, that Luke Acts presents itself as being historical reportage. It says so in the prologues. Second of all, Paul's letters are just they're letters. They're correspondence with churches. So they're obviously not a fictional genre. He's teaching doctrine and such, and giving instruction and all that kind of thing. And so I don't see how like Homer's Odyssey or any kind of other like Greek fictional works is relevant here.
Eric, it's relevant in the sense that it's a parallel religious text that talks about interaction between humans and gods, and
What are the points? What are the points of historical confirmation of the Odyssey that are parallel to what we find in the Book of Acts, for example?
Well, we would not accept Odyssey or so on, because they supposedly quote real cities, real Greek cities. Well, these happen, these or that, therefore it's historical.
Well, no one argues that.
Yeah, that's not the
I
argument
haven't
that
made that
we're
argument.
making. Yeah, that's not even the argument. Can you tell us
But,
what? Can you try to like, if you had to steelman our argument, could you?
great, because no, I'm first of all, I'm trying to show that it's much more similar that we think. It's much more.
Why would
You
it be
know,
similar when we have letters from a real person writing to real people in churches? And that we
well,
find
but
that the history corresponds in undesigned and casual ways. It interlocks in ways with the book of Acts, which purports to be real history. And then we're not even talking a lot of these examples that Jonathan's giving you here. Some do include like cases of miracles, like in the example between First Thessalonians chapter 2 and Acts chapter 16. But a lot of these are just like Paul received an offering. Paul had traveling companions. Paul baptized some guys. So like, why should we think that like this is fiction?
you know, we know that it's possible to write, sorry, fictional letters for fictional persons using real names, so on.
But the
Whoa,
argument
whoa, whoa.
we've been introducing argues very strongly against that, right?
Yeah. Are you saying that Paul's letters are fictional? That they're not really written by Paul? That they're not really written to churches that really existed in the Roman Empire?
Where are those churches?
Well,
Galatia,
Corinth,
Colossae,
like-
Rome, Corinth.
We don't have the data. We don't have the
We have letters.
the archaeological stuff of told
Do
churches
we?
and so on.
Yeah, well, we have a lot of people's letters that we don't have archaeological confirmation of what? Archaeological confirmation of what? That actually we do have archaeological confirmation that Paul traveled with a guy Timothy traveled with a guy from Corinth by the name of Erastus. I think so. Like we've already talked about that one.
we have archaeological evidence for Erastus. It is disputed, but there is a pavement slab in Corinth that it says that Erastus, in return for his aedleship, bore the expense of this pavement. It's disputed as to whether it's the same Erastus, although many scholars think it is, but it's contestable. But nonetheless, it's not material to the particular argument I made, because Romans also confirms that Erastus was from Corinth, which is all you need for that particular undesigned coincidence.
Right.
Well, guys, but we are when we are talking about New Testament and archaeology, I guess that we are really talking about something problematic, because something that called my attention, it's that Josephus, I don't believe in the Testimonio Flaviano, but well, if you would agree, if like 10 or 20% of the New Testament would be true, would really happen, why would not Josephus wrote about those events, such a
I'm not really following your argument here. You're kind of a little bit all over the place, but the reason why we would take Luke as a serious witness is because we have a bunch of evidence that he did indeed travel with Paul, that he did so at personal cost. He was involved in when Paul was being persecuted, chased from town to town, in a shipwreck, and jailed, and all kinds of different things. Okay. And so imprisoned by Rome is what I mean. And so the kind of details that he reports are not things that one could like easily be mistaken about. And so you're basically just saying there's weird stuff in other writings that mention real places, therefore you can't take this seriously. I can't take that seriously as an argument.
Yeah. So how do you understand, or how do you explain the sorts of evidence that we've been reviewing in this stream? So the undesigned coincidences between Acts and Paul's letters. What's your interpretation of that evidence?
Well, I came up some minutes ago, so I would not summarize all of the thing, but I would say shortly that maybe undesigned coincidence can be explained by the dependency among the gospels, because the gospels
Well, we're not
the,
talking
Where's
about
that?
the
the
Gospels
world,
right here,
We're
though.
talking about Acts and Paul's letters
We're
here.
talking about Acts and Paul's letters, and Jonathan already gave examples. Why?
Matthew,
Hold on.
Matthew and Luke, they were writing.
Jonathan, just let me finish super quick, because you just jumped to Matthew. You just said Matthew again. Okay, don't switch, don't shuffle. What we're talking about is the book of Acts and the Paul's letters. So Matthew, forget Matthew for just a second. And then Jonathan already gave arguments that showed that actually Acts is independent from Paul's letters. He talked about the example in 1 Thessalonians chapter 1, verse 9, and Acts 17 for one example, and others. And so like that's there's not dependence. Also, the kind of undesigned coincidences, like, oh, go ahead, Jonathan. I'm sorry.
I didn't mean to interrupt you. You can finish.
Oh, okay. The kind of undesigned coincidences, they're casual. They subtly interlock. They don't look like they're like the product of copying. And so let me just show you something real quick here. This is an example I gave in a video yesterday, and like you said, you're catching up. You didn't watch the entire stream, so that's fine. Give me 1 second to share my screen here. All right. All right. It's not letting me share. Don't know why it's not letting me share. Let me try something. Oh, it's thinking about it. Okay, 1 second. Not sure why it's having a difficulty loading. I mean, I could just kind of, yeah, there we go. All right. Let me see if I can move this back. Okay, so Paul's letters, they repeatedly emphasize a major collection in Jerusalem, but Acts never explains Paul's travels in terms of fundraising. Okay, keep in mind here, this is an offering. This isn't a miracle. There's nothing going on here that has a low prior probability. Okay, basically, the saints in Jerusalem, they had just suffered through a famine. They were dealing with poverty kind of situations, and this is just a fundraiser. Okay, and so in 1 Corinthians 16, 1 through 4, and we know from reading that particular passage that Acts is, that 1 Corinthians is actually written from Ephesus. What does Paul do? He instructs the Corinthians to set aside money weekly for the saints in Jerusalem. And he says that he's going to have representatives carry the gift. But he says that he's basically unsure whether he's going to go himself with it or what. And so also 1 Corinthians 16:5, Paul plans to travel from Ephesus to Macedonia through Achaia, which Corinth is the capital of Achaia. So this actually fits. If we flip over to Acts 19:22, we see that Paul remains in Ephesus while he sends Timothy into Macedonia. Now, a few years later, in 2 Corinthians 8, 1 through 4, and 2 Corinthians was written from Macedonia, Paul describes Macedonian churches giving generously for the relief of the saints. So that indicates, that tells us that the funds are actively being collected in Macedonia. And then in 2 Corinthians 9, 1 through 5, Paul's been basically bragging to the Macedonians on Corinth. He's kind of using some emotional manipulation with the Corinthians. And he's like, hey, yeah, I've been telling the Macedonians that you guys have been getting ready for over a year. And he says that he plans to bring the Macedonians with him to Corinth, and he wants the gift ready, which this actually fits when we read Acts 20, verse 1, where Paul is in Macedonia after leaving Ephesus. Now, I know this takes a little buildup, so just bear with me, and I'm going to tell you why I don't think that it could be copying, okay? Then in Romans 15, which is written in Corinth, Paul says that he's going to Jerusalem with the aid. The collection from Macedonia and Achaia is complete. This places Romans at Acts 8:23, when Paul spends 3 months in Corinth. So Romans is written, and possibly Galatians as well, during this period that Acts 23 describes. Now, notice the shift here. In 1 Corinthians, it says Paul doesn't know whether he'll escort the money, he'll be with them or not, whereas Romans says that he's clearly going to Jerusalem with it, okay? And then again, Acts 19:21, Paul plans to go to Macedonia, Achaia, Jerusalem, then Rome. But Acts never says why he's going to Jerusalem at all. It doesn't make any mention of the fundraising whatsoever to this point. Yet that's the exact route that we can reconstruct independently from Paul's letters by tracking the collection. So Paul, he finally gets to Jerusalem. And in Acts 21:5, he arrives soon and he's arrested. They think that he brought Greeks into the temple. The Jews are mad. He ends up on trial before Felix. This is the only mention that we have of this offering. I came to bring alms to my nation and to present offerings. He just briefly mentions it in a passing remark during this trial. That's it. There's no explanation. There's no buildup. There's no kind of special emphasis here. Acts only mentions the collection indirectly. Paul's letters make the collection like front and center. Like you see it in Galatians, or a little bit. You see it in 2 Corinthians, 1 Corinthians. It's all over there. Yeah, Romans. And so Acts never uses that at all. If it's dependent, if Acts is using Paul's letters, it never uses that whatsoever to explain the narrative. Yet the letters independently reconstruct Paul's exact travel path found in Acts. Acts supplies all the movements. The letters supply the motive. But I mean, you'd have to imagine it doesn't make sense for a fictionalizer to being like, okay, I got Romans in front of me. I got 1 Corinthians in front of me. I got 2 Corinthians in front of me. I got Galatians in front of me. And I'm going to like really slyly like put all this detective work together. And then like, I'm not even going to mention the offering whatsoever. Like, how is that well explained on copy?
Also, if you look at 2 Corinthians, a very prominent character through 2 Corinthians is Titus, never once mentioned in Acts. Moreover, the involvement of Aretas in the plot to assassinate Paul in Damascus is not mentioned in Acts. Acts emphasizes the Jewish involvement instead. Moreover, Paul's list of sufferings that he alludes to in 2 Corinthians 11 cannot be readily correlated with Acts. For example, so we know independently that Paul wrote 2 Corinthians around Acts 20 verses 1 and 2 when Paul's in Macedonia. By that time, apparently, you already have 3 shipwrecks, none of which are mentioned in Acts. In Acts, in fact, it's a different shipwreck in Acts 27. So yeah. I think it's a real stretch to say that the author of Acts is using Paul's letters as a source.
Yeah. So does that make sense? I wasn't trying to at all to be like rude, but you switched over to Matthew and Mark, and we're saying, no, this is a completely, totally different argument with undesigned coincidences in Acts and Paul's letter. And hopefully, I would hope that you see by this particular example, the force of it, at least a little bit. Does that make sense?
Well, guys, I'm being very honest, and sincere about that. I did not catch, because it's totally possible that the author of Acts, that he was with Paul's letters on the table too, and so on. And I know that there are guys that there's a guy that argues very persuasively that Mark, the earliest gospel, would be a kind of expansion of Paul's letters. And
what does that have to do with? How does Mark being an expansion of Paul's letters play into the argument that I just gave you? Again, we're talking about Acts, Paul's letters.
Well, understanding Acts has a kind of second part of the Gospel of Luke that I was,
correct. So the fact that if Luke is a scrupulous writer, as we see here, who seems like he's very close up to the facts, that he's like actually traveling with Paul, and that he does have access to the Jerusalem apostles at certain points during Paul's travels, notably Acts 21 and 18 and others. The better explanation is he's extracting testimony from them. So, like, what do you have to say against the argument that we just gave you? I'm gonna this will be your last chance. Like, stay with Luke Acts. Or Luke Acts Paul's letters.
Eric, I'm really trying to be very honest. That is my feeling about New Testament studies, right? I didn't catch that because of all of this, it's still being possible, be, it can possibly and more probable designed for me, because
Okay,
one was
well, but we're talking about something is mundane. I'm just going to reiterate this one more time, and then
where is your argument? Which is your
so
argument to say that it can't be designed? You can prove that it
the
can't be
argument
designed.
the argument that it's not designed is that Paul only briefly says, "I came to bring alms to my nation and present offerings." He doesn't talk about the offering at all, and yet all the travels and all of that other the like where he goes, all of this, it points to this off. It's all about
And,
this offering.
both letters were written first, and the acts were written
It doesn't
after.
matter when they were written, right?
It's the
It doesn't
perfect
matter.
scenario. It's the perfect scenario to design
So what you're
coincidence.
proposing is that Paul,
You know,
again, that the author of Acts has Second Corinthians, Galatians, First Corinthians, Romans. He's reading these tiny little clues about a mundane offering, and Paul mentioning kind of like where he's going to travel, and then he's going to write that into the book of Acts real subtly, real slyly. Never even mention like the Jerusalem offering whatsoever until he gets to before Felix and says, "I came to bring alms to my nations." If that's what your hypothesis requires in order for you to just escape the conclusion of something such a so like we know Paul, the apostle Paul existed. We know he had traveling companions. Like him bringing an offering to the Jerusalem church is not like a low prior probability event. We're not talking about anything like major here. This is like arguing over like who's carrying the mail to which and what place. Like, so I'm gonna let you go, man. I appreciate you coming up, but I can't follow that. I don't know, Jonathan. I like you got any 2 cents on that? I mean,
Well, I mean, it's an incredibly strange hypothesis to say that the author of Acts is using Paul's letters as a source. I mentioned some of the points for Second Corinthians that establish independence. Also with Galatians, if you read the account in Acts 9, you do not get the impression at all that Paul spent some time in Arabia, for example, right?
right.
In fact, you would get the impression that he spent the entire time between his arrival in Damascus after his conversion and his leaving to go to Jerusalem in Damascus, right? That's what you would. That was the first impression you would get. You also wouldn't get the impression from reading Acts 9 that when he goes to Jerusalem, he only meets with Peter and James. The accounts are not incompatible with what we see in Galatians, but it points, I think, quite forcefully to independence. Moreover, scholars debate whether the meeting in Galatians 2 is the same event as the Jerusalem Council in Acts 15. I tend to think it was. There are other scholars who think it wasn't. The fact that debate can be had is evidence, again, for the independence of Acts and Galatians. The book of Romans, I think, is also independent of Acts. For example, in Acts chapter, I'll pull up my screen here again in a second. In Acts chapter 20, we have a list of companions of Paul who travel with him out. There we go. Out of Corinth. Now, the list of names actually only partially overlaps with the names of those who are with Paul in Corinth in Romans. So in Romans 16, Paul gives us a list of those individuals who were with him while he was in Corinth. These are Timothy, my fellow worker, greets you. So do Lucius and Jason, his offspring, my kinsman. I, Tertius, who wrote this letter, greet you in the Lord. Gaius, who is host to me and to the whole church, greet you. Erastus, city treasurer, and brother Quartus, greet you. These names overlap only partially with the names of those who are traveling with Paul out of Corinth in Acts. Sopater, the Berean son of Persis, accompanied him, and his Thessalonians, Aristarchus, and Sequinus, and Gaius of Derbe, and Timothy, and the Asians, Tychicus, and Trophimus. Now, if Acts is using Romans as a source here, it's surprising, first of all, the names overlap partially, but not completely. There's only two names that overlap. The names are Sopater and Timothy. I actually noticed that there's a variation in spelling. Sopater in Acts, or Zosipater in Romans. These are variations in the spelling of the same name. But if Acts is just using Romans as a source, that variation in spelling is surprising. Moreover, this is a different Gaius than the one mentioned in Acts. How do we know this? Because, first of all, Gaius is the most common Roman first name in antiquity, so it's not especially surprising that you'd have two individuals by different names, but sorry, by the same name, Gaius. But moreover, Gaius is host to Paul in Corinth, and he's actually host of the house church there. But this Gaius in Acts is Gaius of Derbe. Now, if Acts were using Romans as a source, it's surprising that he invents another guy called Gaius and connects him not with Corinth, as you'd expect from reading Romans and First Corinthians, but he connects him with Derbe.
Mhm.
That also points to the independence of Acts and Romans, and that you have this partial overlap between the names in Romans and Acts, which is confirmatory of historicity. Moreover, here's another point that relates back to the collection that Paul was receiving for the relief of the saints in Jerusalem. I think this is an even more compelling point. In 1 Corinthians 16, Paul says, "Now concerning the collection for the saints, as I directed the churches of Galatia, so you also are to do. On the first day of every week, each of you is to put something aside and store it up as he may prosper. So there'll be no collecting when I come. And when I arrive, I will send those whom you accredit by letter to carry your gift to Jerusalem. If it seems advisable that I should go also, they will accompany me." Notice that he says that if it seems advisable that I should go also, they will accompany me. And this is actually this question of whether Paul will accompany the funds is resolved by the time he writes the letter to the Romans. But here he wants integrity with the finances, right? He wants there to be accountability en route to when he's on his way to Judea. Now, in Acts 20, verse 4, we read, "Zopater the Berean, son of Pyrrhus, accompanied him, and of the Thessalonians, Aristarchus and Secundus and Gaius of Derbe and Timothy and the Asians, Tychicus and Trophimus." So here, this is actually the longest list in the book of Acts of a group of companions of Paul, all traveling somewhere at the same time. And notice that the locations they're from are very carefully charted along with their names. Now, why would you have such a large company traveling with Paul and their names and places they're from are very carefully charted? Because these presumably were representatives of the Gentile churches who were escorting the money with Paul to Jerusalem. But again, Acts doesn't even mention fundraising as the purpose of this journey, but it fits in a very undesigned and casual way with what we see in the letters. Do we have any other guests?
We do not at the moment. We'll go through some super chats super quick here. Koopa, morning Koopa. He said he wanted to come today, but he is doing a little moving or packing or something like that. And so, Koopa, you're always welcome. Appreciate you, bro. Paul was a Nazarene. This sect, James, Jesus, et al., walked through Torah to Gentiles, grafted into Israel. One law for native sojourner, no diff between Jew and Greek. Salvation by faith, discipleship by... I don't know what's going on here. Sorry, Peter, I don't know. Discerning an argument or something here, Jonathan, or it's just worth responding to, or should we just move on? Yeah, I don't know what's going on. No. Sounds a little Hebrew rootsy to me, but I don't know what he's trying to argue there. If he's trying to argue anything at all, or just say something. But thank you for the super chat. I appreciate it. Beyond Sky, are there any explanations for the notable absence of Titus in Acts when he was a distinguished companion of Paul, noted several times in his letters? Jonathan, you kind of alluded to that a little bit, but go ahead and maybe go over that again. Or
no, I mean, some authors just fail to mention something for one reason or another, and we can speculate all day, but it's not particularly helpful. I mean, it's useful from an apologetic standpoint that Acts doesn't mention Titus, because it points to the independence, particularly of Acts and 2 Corinthians, because 2 Corinthians is Titus is a very prominent character in 2 Corinthians. But as to why Acts fails to mention Titus, I don't know.
Yeah, I would.
But it's inconceivable if Acts were using 2 Corinthians as a source and deliberately trying to construct narratives on the basis of 2 Corinthians that he never even mentions Titus. It's not a completely decisive point, but it contributes to a broader case. I mean, also the emphasis on Aratus IV in 2 Corinthians 11 in the plot to assassinate Paul, never mentioned, not mentioned in Acts 9, when Acts tells us about the same episode. The non-correlation between the sufferings alluded to in 2 Corinthians 11 and Acts, and actually that also gives rise to another undesigned coincidence, by the way. Because in 2 Corinthians 11. Let me share my screen here again. 1 second. Here we go. In 2 Corinthians 11, Paul gives a laundry list of his sufferings. He says, 5 times I received at the hands of the Jews the 40 lashes less one. 3 times I was beaten with rods, once I was stoned, 3 times I was shipwrecked, and night and day I was adrift at sea, and frequent journeys, danger from rivers, danger from robbers, danger from my own people, danger from Gentiles, danger in the city, danger in the wilderness, danger at sea, danger from false brothers, and toil and hardship, though many a sleepless night, and hunger and thirst, often without food, and cold and exposure. Notice that although this list is not readily correlatable with Acts, it never once contradicts Acts, even though it very easily could have done. For example, he says, once I was stoned. Now, we can, as we've already discussed, we can place the writing of Romans quite confidently in Acts 20, verses 1 and 2. By that time, apparently you have only one stoning, according to 2 Corinthians. Now, if Acts had narrated more than one stoning prior to Acts 20, there would be a direct conflict with 2 Corinthians. And Acts does mention a stoning that occurs in Lystra. And so if Acts had narrated a second stoning, there would be a direct conflict with 2 Corinthians. In fact, he comes very close to getting stoned when he's in Iconium. When an attempt was made by both Gentiles and Jews with their rulers to mistreat them and to stone them, they learned of it and fled to Lystra and Derbe, cities of Lycaonia, and to the surrounding country, and there they continued to preach the gospel. So if Luke had reported that that stoning plot was successful, there would be a direct conflict with 2 Corinthians, which insists that once I was stoned prior to Acts 20, verses 1 and 2, when he wrote 2 Corinthians. By the way, here's another undesigned coincidence that just came to my head that's also a good one. So in Philippians 3, Paul says that he's of the tribe of Benjamin.
Yeah.
That's also indicated by Romans 11, which indicates that he is a member of the tribe of Benjamin. Now, that detail is not supplied by Acts, but Acts supplies a detail not found that Paul had an alternative name, which was Saul, right? For example, in Acts 13, we read Paul about Saul, who was also called Paul. So he has the other name, namely Saul. Now, Paul's letters don't mention that detail, and Acts doesn't mention him being of the tribe of Benjamin. But who's the most famous Benjaminite in the Old Testament? King Saul, right? And so it was customary to name your children after a famous Benjaminite from your tribe. The other references Romans 11, where it mentions he's the tribe of Benjamin. So that also, I think, fits together in a nice way with the account in Acts. By the way, we haven't even covered external points of confirmation of Acts, of which there's over 100. This is also a torrent of evidence. Here's one of my favorite examples. In Acts 27, we read about Paul's shipwreck. It says, when the south wind blew gently, supposing that they'd obtained their purpose, they weighed anchor and sailed along Crete close to the shore. But soon a tempestuous wind, called a northeaster, struck down from the land. And when the ship was caught, it could not face the wind. We gave way to it and were driven along. This is actually consistent with the meteorological evidence, because the meteorological evidence confirms that there is typically a sudden change from a mild southerly wind to a violent northeasterly wind that occurs in the late fall in the eastern Mediterranean. And we know from verse 9 that this is around the Day of Atonement, which is in the late fall. So that fits very nicely with the meteorological evidence. But then verse 16 says, running under the lee of a small island called Cauda, we managed with difficulty to secure the ship's boat. So to show this on the map here, they're trying to navigate along the coastline of Crete, but they get blown off course by the northeasterly wind. Oops. This one. They get blown off course by the northeasterly wind, and they get driven by this island of Cauda. Now, the ancients found it really difficult to geographically locate islands that were that far off coast. In fact, Ptolemy, who was a geographer, and Pliny the Elder, who was an encyclopedist, which are sources that are contemporary with Luke, had the estimates in Luke today of the geographical location of Cauda. Both contradict Luke, but Luke's account alone is the only one that actually gets the implied location of the Isle of Cauda correct. So Colin Heemer, in his book, The Book of Acts and the Setting of Hellenistic History, notes that as the implications of such details are further explored, it becomes increasingly difficult to believe that they could have been derived from any contemporary reference work. In the places where we can compare, Luke fares much better than the encyclopedist Pliny. He might be regarded as the foremost first-century example of such a source. Pliny places Cauda opposite Hyrapna, some 90 miles too far east. Even Ptolemy, who offers a reckoning of latitude and longitude, makes a serious dislocation to the northwest, putting Cauda too near the western end of Crete, in a position which would not suit the unstudied narrative of our text. And so hopefully you're getting a sense that the author of Acts is someone who is extremely well-informed, very close up to the facts, and in the habit of being truthful, which lays the foundational premise for the conversion of Paul argument by establishing that that And that provides in itself a reason to think that Paul's claim, that the accounts in Acts concerning Paul's testimony and concerning his conversion, his miracles that he purportedly performed and experienced, represent Paul's own testimony. But there's actually also more direct reason to think that. For example, in Galatians 1, so Paul, throughout his letters, in multiple letters, seems to imply that his testimony was quite widely known and circulated. It seems that he'd gone around talking about it. For example, in 1 Corinthians, he says, "Am I not free? Am I not an apostle? Have I not seen Jesus our Lord?" He takes it for granted his audience know what he's talking about, right? He doesn't have to spell it out. In 1 Corinthians 15, likewise, he says, "Then he appeared to James and to all the apostles. Last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared also to me. For I am the least of the apostles, unworthy to be called an apostle, because I persecuted the church of God." So again, he takes it for granted his audience know what he's talking about. He doesn't need to explain the background. His audience know already. Or in Philippians 3, he says, he says, "I have, if anyone else thinks he has reason for confidence in the flesh, I have more circumcised in the 8th day of the people of Israel, the tribe of Benjamin, the Hebrew of Hebrews, as to the law of Pharisee, as to zeal of persecutor of the church, as to righteousness under the law, blameless," and so on. Again, he takes it for granted his audience know what he's talking about concerning his backstory. Or in Galatians 1, this is the most striking example. He says, "For I would have you know, brothers, that the gospel that was preached by me is not man's gospel. For I did not receive it from any man, nor was I taught it, but I received it through a revelation of Jesus Christ. For you've heard," notice, "you've heard of my former life in Judaism." So again, he takes it for granted his audience know what he's talking about. And Paul's visited the churches in Galatia, so presumably he's talked about his testimony with them. And so he says, "You've heard of my former life in Judaism, how I persecuted the church of God violently, tried to destroy it. And I was advancing in Judaism beyond many of my own age among my people. So extremely zealous was I for the traditions of my fathers. But when he had set me apart before I was born, and called me by his grace, was pleased to reveal his son to me, in order that I might preach among the Gentiles, I did not immediately consult with anyone, nor did I go out to Jerusalem to those who were apostles before me, but I went away into Arabia. I returned again to Damascus." Now, what's the significance of Damascus? Now, as modern readers, we read this and we don't skip a beat, because we know the story about Paul's conversion to Damascus, and he was, or on the road to Damascus, and he was instructed to go into Damascus following that. And he spent considerable time there in Damascus before going on to Jerusalem. But the original readers of Galatians hadn't read Acts. How do we know this? Because Acts hadn't been written yet. And as Paley notes in his Hora Polyne, in this quotation from the epistle, "I desire to be remarked how incidentally it appears that they fare past at Damascus. In what may be called the direct part of the account, no mention is made of the place of his conversion at all. A casual expression at the end, expression written for a different purpose, alone fixes it to be at Damascus, and returned again to Damascus. Nothing can be more like simplicity and undesignedness than this is." Moreover, he goes on, "Then after 3 years I went out to Jerusalem to visit Cephas," Simon Peter, "and remained with him 15 days, but I saw none of the other apostles except James the Lord's brother." Now, this text suggests that Paul's trip to Jerusalem got cut short. He's only there 15 days. He only has time to really meet up with Peter and James. Why such a short visit? Well, it's of course a much shorter visit than his time in Damascus. Well, we read in Acts 9, this is when he's in Jerusalem, "He spoke and disputed against the Hellenists, but they were seeking to kill him. And when the brothers learned this, they brought him down to Caesarea and sent him off to Tarsus." And so there's an assassination plot against Paul. So that explains then why his trip to Jerusalem got cut short. Now, for the reasons that we've already discussed, Galatians and Acts appear to be independent of each other. Acts does not appear to be dependent on Galatians. There's the trip to Arabia mentioned here that is never mentioned in Acts. In fact, you wouldn't get the impression at all that Paul spent time outside of Damascus during this time between verses 23 and 25. Moreover, you wouldn't get the impression from reading Acts 9 that he only met with Peter and James. Right, it says that Barnabas took him and brought him to the apostles and declared to them how on the road he had seen the Lord who spoke to him, and how at Damascus he had preached boldly in the name of Jesus. So he went in and out among them at Jerusalem, preaching boldly in the name of Jesus, of the Lord. That's a strange way of wording it on the part of Acts if he'd read Galatians and knew that he only spent time with Peter and James. Moreover, as I said, there's a debate over whether Galatians 2 refers to the same event as the Acts 15 council. I tend to think it was. There are other scholars who think it wasn't, but the fact that debate can be had is evidence for independence of Acts and Galatians. And so you have independent access from Acts and Galatians to Paul's own testimony. Galatians because it was written by Paul, and Acts because Luke was an associate of Paul who reliably represents the information that he'd received from Paul. So also 2 Corinthians 11 mentions Paul's escape from Damascus, right? Where there was an assassination plot, and he says that Damascus, the governor under King Aretas, was guarding the city of Damascus in order to seize me, but I was let down in a basket through a window in the wall and escaped his hands. In Acts 9, we see when many days had passed, the Jews plotted to kill him, but their plot became known to Saul. They were watching the gates day and night in order to kill him, but his disciples took him by night and let him down through an opening in the wall, lowering him in a basket. There's no mention there of the involvement of Aretas, and Acts doesn't mention, Second Corinthians doesn't mention the involvement of the Jews. So again, this points to independence of Second Corinthians and Acts, and you have convergence on the core details, which again supports that Second Corinthians and Acts are accurately, independently representing Paul's own testimony. Eric, do we have anyone in the?
We do not. Somebody did make a comment that I thought was I might address real quick here. So 1 second, let me share my screen. So somebody said that there's been some recent videos trying to say Luke is getting stuff from Josephus. I feel like I could use this for some refutations. And I would say, yeah, in some ways indirectly it can. And then also one reason I don't think that Acts is using Josephus is just how casual. If he's using Josephus, he's being really weirdly sneaky about it, because in Acts 23, Paul appears before the Jewish council. He's struck on the mouth at Ananias' command, and Paul rebukes him, and he's like, hey, you can't do that. That's against the law. God is going to strike you, you whitewashed wall. And Paul is rebuked back, saying, would you revile God's high priest? And then Paul says, well, I didn't know he was the high priest. So the question kind of comes up here is like, well, wait a second. Like, Paul's supposedly, according to the narrative, a student of Gamaliel, a Pharisee of the Pharisees. So why doesn't Paul recognize the high priest? But Josephus actually explains in Antiquities, he mentions that Ananias, the son of Nebuchadnezzar, was appointed high priest. And this is the high priest here. And ends up being sent to Rome by Governor Quadratus to answer for charges. He's basically going around and acting like a thug, and the Jews were kind of like sick of his shenanigans. Though he was acquitted, he wasn't restored to office. Jonathan replaced him as high priest during Felix's term, but Jonathan, was who replaced him as the high priest. That's what I was trying to say. He ended up being murdered in the temple. The office was vacant, and there was actually no high priest until Ismail, the son of Phabi, which was appointed by Agrippa. Again, this is all in Antiquities. Right here, you see the references. And so what is going on here is that Acts 23 occurs during that vacancy. Ananias was just acting as if he still held the office. Paul, when he says, well, I didn't know he was the high priest, is very likely being sarcastic. He's throwing shade. He's not really the high priest. And we do see that, like, Paul does use sarcasm in his letters, in many other places. You know, of course, we have Galatians where he's like, hey, you Judaizers who say you have to be circumcised in order to be saved, like, why don't you go ahead and just cut yourself off, you know, or just keep cutting, don't stop. Or in 1 Corinthians 4:8-13, he is just dripping with sarcasm. He's talking about, well, hey, yeah, you guys are kings, well, we're just fools, and all this other kind of stuff. And so I don't think that the whole theory that, like, Acts is just very carefully copying Josephus. He's finding these little nuggets. He's constructing a story, but then he never mentions the backstory or the history, like, whatsoever. And then he makes this subtle little comment of like, well, I didn't know he was the high priest. That kind of leaves the question wondering what Paul is even really saying here. So,
yeah, I mean, I think one of the best critiques of Mason's thesis that Acts is indebted to Josephus is actually Ben Witherington. If I can share my screen here. So he notes, if we return for a moment to the list Mason gives of important correspondences and major figures and events between Josephus and Luke, it will be immediately seen that in each case we are talking about major political figures whose lives and exploits are widely known among Jews, especially among Jews in the Holy Land. It is far from unlikely that Luke could have had independent information of these figures and their lives from sources other than Josephus. Indeed, it is perfectly plausible that he had such information from his own investigations during his time in Caesarea and Jerusalem. It is even possible, if indeed Luke wrote in the 70s or 80s for a patron such as Theophilus in Rome, that Josephus had access to Luke's work, though on the whole, I think they both drew independently on traditions and stories about these major figures. It remains here for us to consider the material for Mason that that for Mason seems to clinch the matter that Luke is probably indebted to Josephus. The Theudas, Judas, Egyptian references found in Antiquity of the Jews, as well as some references in the Jewish War, let us first point out that the reference to the Egyptian is historically perfectly plausible in Acts 21 and comports with what Josephus suggests in regard to some of the substance and the date. The Egyptian was a figure who appeared and caused trouble during the rule of Felix, the end of which period is also the time when Paul is taken into custody in Jerusalem. Yet Luke and Josephus also disagree on important facts. Acts 21 suggests the Egyptian led a band of daggermen, Sicarii. Josephus suggests he was not associated with such people, but rather was a prophetic figure. Acts suggests he led about 4,000 into the desert. Josephus that he led his followers 30,000 to the Mount of Olives to prepare to seize the city. Mason admits these differences, but he attributes them to Luke's poor memory of what Josephus said. Poor memory might lead to a jumbling up of some facts, but it hardly accounts for the difference in the number of followers. Are we to think Luke picked a number at random, not remembering at all what Josephus said? Is it not more plausible to conclude that Luke and Josephus had independent traditions about the Egyptian that differed on some important matters? There is one further factor Mason does not take into account. Luke is reporting here the off-the-cuff remarks of a Roman tribute under the duress who himself could have jumbled up the facts. Were these the remarks of one of Luke's main positive characters? One could more plausibly assume that the views expressed reflected Luke's own understanding. This is less certain in a case like this one, especially since we will see in Lysias's letter to the procurator his ability to bend the truth. We turn now to the more difficult matter of what to make of the reference to Theudas and Judas in that order. Mason points to the same order in Josephus' discussion of these two figures in Antiquities of the Jews. He suggests that Luke remembered the order of Josephus' discussion, but forgot that Josephus had indicated that Judas was a much earlier figure. In short, his memory was selective, and what he remembered was not the actual substance of Josephus' account, but the order. It must be admitted that this seems strange, especially when one is talking about an ancient historian like Luke, who is far more likely to concentrate on matters of substance than matters of chronological order. As Bruce says, only very superficial and cursory glance at Josephus could give a reader the impression that Judas himself came after Theudas. There was also the conundrum pointed out by Johnson that if Luke was simply following Josephus in regard to Theudas rather than drawing on independent testimony, why would he have left out the fact that Theudas saw himself as the prophet mentioned by Moses, since Theudas as false prophet could have served as a perfect foil to Luke's portrayal of Jesus as the true Mosaic prophet? If there is a more plausible explanation, it should be given preference to this theory of selective bad and good memory. He says, let's consider the other options. The theory that I land on myself is that this is, in fact, this is the fourth option he gives, that there's the possibility, which should not be leaped to but not dismissed either, that there was an earlier Theudas who caused difficulties before 6 AD when the Judas matter arose. As the inscriptional evidence lets us know, Theudas was a common enough name. And as anyone who has carefully read Josephus knows, the latter mentions 4 Simons within 40 years and 3 Judases within 10 years as instigators of rebellion. Add to this that the testimony of Codex Bezae tells us that the Theudas mentioned in Acts committed suicide, while Josephus tells us he was captured alive and beheaded. And one can understand why some text critics think that Luke and Josephus are referring to two different Theudases. In view of these facts, the suggestion of 2 troublemakers named Theudas seems a modest proposal. So that's the view that I myself lean towards there.
Yeah. No, that's awesome. What is that? Is his commentary on Acts?
Yeah, that's correct.
Witherington. Okay. Yeah. All right. Cool. We do have some super chats, so we'll go through those, and then if nobody comes up, we might just wrap up here. Faith on Fire Pod. Love you guys always. Christ be praised. Love you too, bro. Thank you for the super chat. Thank you, brothers, for taking the time to do this. You bet, little kitten. That is a little kitten. I don't know why I always look at the profile pics. Do you think Theudas mentioned in Acts is a nickname like Theodorus? I'm trying to find a good source for this. Jonathan, you got 2 cents on that? So
no.
Yeah, I wouldn't think so either. Just kind of, I will bring this up real quick here. That is one of the mistakes that people do bring up, is that Acts makes historical blunders. And so this is a quote from Bart Ehrman on his blog. I actually just found this in his comment section where somebody said, well, yeah, what about Theudas? And Bart says there are lots of mistakes in Acts as well. For example, when Gamaliel talks in chapter 5, talking about Judas of Galilee coming after Theudas, which is just wrong. So to kind of draw out the argument, what is Bart actually talking about here? In Acts 5:37, Gamaliel refers to Judas of Galilee, linked to the 86 through 7 census under Quirinius. He also mentions Theudas, who led a failed result. Critics say this contradicts Josephus, which again is another, like Jonathan just alluded to there, it's a good reason to think that they're independent, who places Theudas later, but that only assumes that one Theudas existed. Josephus says that Judea was crawling with would-be messiahs and rebel leaders, and Theudas is just a common name, like Judas. The name Theudas in the Greek form of names is like Nathaniel or Mathaniah, or Mattaniah. Multiple uprisings by men with common names is exactly what Josephus says kept happening. So I don't think that Luke make a mistake here at all. And we do have this whole lesson of Lysanias. Luke names a guy by the name of Lysanias, Tetrarch of Galilee, in Luke 3:1. And for a long time, skeptics made fun of this because Josephus records a Lysanias killed decades way too early, and it looked like a big historical blunder. But then archaeologists discovered the Abila inscription, and it mentions another Lysanias ruling Abilene during Tiberius's reign, which is exactly what Luke said. And so the lesson here is that critics often assume too quickly that similar names definitely mean a contradiction, but we see just this example that history proves otherwise. And so I just wanted to, kind of throw that out there since somebody had asked about Theudas there. So let's see if there's any other super chats there. One more from Norbel Rose. Do you have a view on who the men from James are in Galatians 2? James seems to support Paul's mission in Galatians 2:9, so it's strange if he opposes it later.
So, this is in Galatians 2, verse 11 and 12. Pull this up here. So it says, when Cephas came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face because he stood condemned. For before certain men came from James, he was eating with the Gentiles. But when they came, he drew back and separated himself, fearing the circumcision party. And the rest of the Jews acted hypocritically along with him, so that even Barnabas was led astray by their hypocrisy. Notice it's not actually over a theological difference between Paul and Peter here. It's over Peter is acting like a hypocrite in that he's withdrawing from eating with the Gentiles. So we don't know exactly what happened here. Men came from James. We don't know whether it was endorsed by James or not. But anyway, Peter was evidently led into hypocrisy by these men who came from James, and he withdrew from eating with the Gentiles. But we don't know we don't know any more information than what Paul gives us here. Anything you would add there, Eric?
I mean, just sometimes history is like that, where it just leaves kind of some questions that we just might not know. And so, yeah.
If you want, we can talk briefly about some of the miracles of Paul. Should we go into that?
Yeah, sure. Might as well, since we don't have another guest, and then probably do that for another 15 or so minutes. And then if nobody else comes up, we'll just wrap it up.
Sure. So we mentioned earlier already Paul's miraculous jailbreak in Acts 16, right? And we correlated that with an undesigned coincidence in 1 Thessalonians 2, where Paul says, though he'd already suffered and been shameless treatment in Philippi, as you know, right? And so how did the Thessalonians know about Paul's shameful treatment in Philippi? Well, that makes sense in light of Acts, because Acts 17 indicates that Paul's very next port of call is Thessalonica. But this particular scene is inextricable from Paul's miraculous jailbreak in Acts 16 in Philippi, which indicates that very probably this represents Paul's own testimony that Luke had received from Paul. To take another example, in Acts 14, Paul is in Lystra, and it says at Lystra, there was a man sitting who could not use his feet. He was crippled from birth and had never walked. He listened to Paul speaking, and Paul, looking intently at him and seeing that he had faith to be made well, said in a loud voice, "Stand upright on your feet." And he sprang up and began walking. And when the crowd saw what Paul had done, they lifted up their voices, saying in Lycaonian, "The gods have come down to us in the likeness of men." Now, this is an unusual detail about Lystra, that they spoke Lycaonian, because the most common language spoken, especially in the cosmopolitan and Hellenized society in which Paul moved, was Greek. Greek was the trade language of the ancient world at this time. It was the equivalent then of English, and it was the most common language spoken. But this is an unusual detail that Luke tells us about Lystra, that they apparently preserved their native language of Lycaonian. And this actually is confirmed by archaeological evidence. As Colin Hemer notes in his book, The Book of Acts and the Setting of Hellenistic History, the Lycaonian language is spoken in Lystra. The use of a native language is unusual in the cosmopolitan Hellenized society to which Paul moved. Lystra, however, as a Roman colony in the less developed part of Anatolia, preserved a language otherwise attested in the Gloss and Stephanus of Byzantium. Moreover, and remember, this is an age before Google and Wikipedia. You can't just hop on Google or Wikipedia and look up this sort of thing. This is specialized local knowledge. And if you miss one local fact, you give yourself away as making things up. But Luke is constantly hitting these local facts and getting them right, even when they're difficult things to get right. Moreover, we read that Barnabas they called Zeus and Paul Hermes because he was the chief speaker. And we actually have archaeological evidence also that Zeus and Hermes was the local cult of Lystra. The fact that they identify Paul as Hermes and Barnabas as Zeus is also consistent with the ancient belief that when two deities visited Earth, it was the lesser deity that did the talking. So these points suggest again that this account of Paul healing a guy in Lystra who'd been crippled since birth represents Paul's own testimony, the miraculous jailbreak and healing this guy who'd been crippled since birth, greatly impressing the crowds, are difficult things to be honestly wrong about. To take another example, in Acts 13, he's on Cyprus and he curses this guy, Elymas, also known as Bar Jesus, so that he goes blind. So we read about him encountering this Jewish false prophet named Bar Jesus. He was with the proconsul, Sergius Paulus, a man of intelligence, who summoned Barnabas and Saul and sought to hear the word of God. But Elymas the magician, for that is the meaning of his name, opposed him, seeking to turn the proconsul away from the faith. But Paul, who was also called Paul, filled with the Holy Spirit, looked intently at him and said, "You son of the devil, you enemy of all righteousness, full of all deceit and villainy, will you not stop making crooked the straight paths of the Lord? And now behold, the hand of the Lord is upon you, and you'll be blind and unable to see the sun for a time." Immediately mist and darkness fell upon him, and he went about seeking people to lead him by the hand. Then the proconsul believed when he saw what had occurred, for he was astonished at the teaching of the Lord. So notice that Luke mentions that the lead official on Cyprus was the proconsul. Now, there were two types of Roman provinces. There were imperial provinces and there were senatorial provinces. Imperial provinces were seen to require more military oversight. Syria province, for example, was a imperial province. In 6 AD, they annexed Judea, and it became part of Syria province. They were under the jurisdiction of a legate, and under the legates were the prefects, which later became known as procurators. Pontius Pilate was himself a Roman prefect of Judea. But there was a smaller number of senatorial provinces. There was around 12 to 15 at this time, which were under the jurisdiction of a proconsul. And they were seen to require less military oversight. And in fact, Cassius Dio informs us that in 22 BC, Cyprus was made by Caesar Augustus a senatorial province, whereas previously it had been an imperial province. He tells us that it was at this time that Caesar Augustus restored to the people both Cyprus and Gallia Narbonensis as districts, no longer needing the presence of his armies, and thus proconsuls began to be sent to these provinces also. So it becomes a senatorial province, and there's actually evidence that later on, by the time of the Flavian dynasty, it had already switched back to being an imperial province again. So this is something that's easy to get wrong and relatively difficult to get right. That Cyprus is under the jurisdiction of a proconsul, and rather than being an imperial province. And moreover, he names the specific proconsul on Cyprus. He gives the name as Sergius Paulus. Now, there's actually archaeological evidence of a certain Paulus, who was proconsul on Cyprus during the 10th year of some emperor. Unfortunately, the inscription is damaged, so we don't have the emperor's name. But it's quite plausible, and many scholars believe that this is the same Sergius Paulus as referred to here in Acts. Even if it's not, though, it nonetheless indicates that the family of Sergius Paulus was related to Lystra, to Cyprus, and held the office of proconsul there. Moreover, there's another archaeological inscription on Pisidian Antioch that bears the name of a certain Lucius Sergius Paulus the Younger, who is almost certainly a relative of this Sergius Paulus, perhaps his son or some other relative, a nephew or something. Now, it's interesting that Paul's very next port of call after Cyprus is not the most obvious place to go after Cyprus. It's Pisidian Antioch, where we know independently from archaeological evidence that this Sergius Paulus had relatives, right, in Pisidian Antioch. So it's quite plausible then that the proconsul, Sergius Paulus, had commissioned or encouraged Paul and Barnabas to take the gospel to his relatives in Pisidian Antioch. That's somewhat speculative, but we do know that he had relatives in Pisidian Antioch. And so these points taken together suggest that, again, this account in Acts 13 represents Paul's own testimony. Aside from the broader case for Acts being someone who's habitually scrupulous and well informed about Paul's itinerary and travels, which in itself provides reason to think that the accounts of Paul's miracles represent Paul's own testimony. And so when you consider Paul's testimony in aggregate, it seems highly implausible that he could be sincerely mistaken. And we've also seen that it's highly implausible he was a liar about his testimony. And so it seems then that the best explanation is that the content of what he alleged is true, that Paul really did have an encounter with Jesus on the Damascus Road, and that led to his conversion.
Yeah. That's lots of good stuff. I'm going to put your article in the chat because you do have a really excellent article with even more details on here. And so go to jonathanmcclatchy.com. Be sure to hit the blog. There are so many good articles, which is more of this kind of chock full of goodies like these. And so, yeah, definitely do that. And so looks like we got another guest here. Oh, no, he went back. I remember when my kid would do, my youngest daughter, she just like discovered opening doors, and it was just like, let me do this over and over again. This is amazing. And so, yeah, but anyways, all right. Well, we don't have any other guests. A little short on guests. We just had Mr. Aura Farmer, Skibbity Rizzler, and Jonathan. And so, but still lots and lots of good information. I think it would probably be a good thing just to talk about doubts, because for those of you guys who don't know, Jonathan runs a ministry called Talk About Doubts, where you have dozens of awesome counselors who have degrees or backgrounds and degrees in history, theology, science, archaeology, all kinds of stuff. And so if you are a Christian with doubts, or if you are maybe an ex-Christian, but you wonder if there's a rational path back to faith, or you are just a sincere seeker and maybe you're open to this whole Christianity thing, but you're just not sure, no matter what, definitely go to the website, fill out the form. It's real simple. We do free Zoom calls, one-on-one, two-on-one calls, and we are happy to talk to you. And so if maybe you're watching this later and you wanted to call in, but you just didn't have the opportunity, don't worry. You can hit that form and we could just talk to you privately about your doubts over Zoom at a time that works for you. And we have many different people that can speak to you about evidence, just like some of the evidence that we went through here. And so, all right, well, I think that might do it, unless, Jonathan, you have anything else you want to add real quick, or like a final punchline to all of this?
No, I think we're good. Again, I reiterate what Eric said. Feel free to reach out to talkaboutdoubts.com. We'd love to talk to you, especially if you're a Christian with doubts, or a former Christian, or even a non-Christian who's sincerely interested in exploring the evidence for Christianity. I would be more than willing to set up a private Zoom call to talk with you about this. And also check out my article on my website, jonathanmcclatchy.com, on the conversion and miracles of Paul. It's a very convincing argument, and is one of only several arguments for the truth of Christianity. The other arguments would include the resurrection of Jesus, the Christological trilemma, messianic prophecy, modern miracles. These are what I call the major arguments for Christianity. There's also, in addition to those, more minor arguments for Christianity, which aren't as compelling in themselves, but contribute to that larger, broader cumulative case too.
All right. Awesome, guys. Well, thank you guys so much for joining, and thank you guys for all the super chats as well. Your comments, if you like the stream and all that good stuff, be sure to share this and all of the things. And so, all right, we will see you on the next one.